Well, thank you folks for sticking around to the end. This is one that I've personally been looking forward to for a while, so I'm going to be back in the back row taking notes. I'd like to introduce you to Matthew Burtnick, Senior Vice President at Profound Medical, who will be talking about registries with this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to moderate this session on registries. I think it's a really interesting, it's an important topic, but also a really interesting topic because from a manufacturer's perspective, I think there's a lot of different considerations that one needs to think about as you embark on the road to registries. So before I kind of give a little bit of an introduction, we'll take a moment to introduce the panelists. So we have Karen Cornet. Do you want to introduce yourself?
For having me today. I have been with Sonoblate Corp since 2010. My background is nursing. I'm currently Vice President of Clinical Operations, leading the customer support, training, clinical account, and service teams.
Awesome. We also have Katie Grant.
Hi, Katie Gant, and I'm a medical science liaison at Insightec. I've been with Insightec a little bit over a year before joining Insightec. I was a research assistant professor at the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis, part of the University of Miami. Ran a lot of clinical trials there, and our medical affairs team at Insightec is relatively new within the past year. We sit within the strategy team at Insightec, so I work really closely with our market, US reimbursement and global market access teams. So we think a lot about what happens after approval to create value to our commercial team.
Fantastic. And on Zoom, I think we have here Matthias Bomer. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly.
Yeah, it's Baumhauer. Yeah. Thanks, Matthew. My name is Matthias Baumhauer. I'm with BrainLab and heading its subsidiary Mint Medical. So Mint originally is a spin-off of the German Cancer Research Center. We started in 2009, gaining or gathering data from medical imaging, also working within clinical trials, drug approvals. We started to run our first registries for medical societies more than 10 years ago. And at BrainLab, I'm currently responsible for all topics where it's about aggregated data. So whenever we deal with data, just not for the sole purpose to improve patient treatment and diagnosis of a single patient, but also to look for a broader and bigger value of the aggregated data. My background is engineering and technical informatics, and I have a PhD in medical imaging.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthias. So, registries, as I mentioned, is an important topic, and the previous session on prostate, they touched also on, crossing that chasm to standard of care, getting into guidelines, approvals, reimbursements, some of those topics. So under that umbrella, I think registries do provide a lot of value for the field, for manufacturers. I mean, certainly from a post-market clinical follow-up perspective, it's important for manufacturers to be able to satisfy regulatory requirements, and registries can be a great way to do that from a post-market follow-up perspective. And it also provides manufacturers in the community a good sense of, or a better sense of, what is the real-world usage of your product. So especially when it's a new product, the panel that we have here, we have literally disruptive technologies where we're bringing invasive surgery to non-invasive surgery. We're asking surgeons to work in an imaging suite, for example. And so when you're just a brand new technology, you have some sort of ownership to be able to not only do your clinical trials to get to your approval, but also look at that post-market real-world scenario. How are real-life physicians using your product on a day-to-day basis? And so to have a data capture mechanism that allows you to capture that data and present on that data, publish on that data, obviously has a ton of value. Overall, the generation of clinical evidence, so again, with these newer types of technologies, the clinical evidence can be very limited. Typically, speaking from Profound's perspective, you do your preclinicals, you do your phase 1, you do your pivotal trial, and in the prostate space, our pivotal trial was 115 patients, which is a large trial, but it's still small numbers when you compare it to the size of a disease like localized prostate cancer. So that ownership to sort of help motivate additional and generate additional clinical evidence is important. I feel as manufacturers we should take some level of responsibility doing that, and again, registries can bring a lot of value to bring that to life. Reimbursement, I think, is another important area that we need to consider, and obviously regulatory approval is one hurdle that you need to go through in order to bring your technology to market. But the bigger mountain after that is reimbursement. How do you, bring your technologies to the masses? And so registries, I think, are, can play an interesting role there. Certainly generating clinical evidence, can generate paper publications, can motivate physicians to adopt your technology. You need a certain number of paper publications to even apply for a CPT code, for example. But at the end of the day, these registries by design are not level 1. They're not randomized controlled trials, which in the previous panel they were talking about, it's almost like checking the box in a way. You need that level 1 data just to have insurance companies sort of listen and approve the claims. And so registries, I think, can bring a lot of value. I think it's still, there can be some controversy as to their true value from a reimbursement perspective, in the sense that they're not level 1, and of course you're in the post-market setting, and so to get that long-term data, 10-year data, can be a long time, especially for a manufacturer. So while there's a lot of value in registries, there can also be a lot of difficulties, which I think we'll touch on as well with the panel. I mean, number one, they can be very expensive, especially for a small, starting company trying to commercialize a device. You've just gone through your pivotal study, which you've invested millions in, and then now you're looking at establishing a registry, which is, again, can be very expensive. You need to think about your database costs. You need to think about whether these databases are in a single country or on an international scale, and some of the ethical and compliance rules that go along with that. Data sharing agreements can become very complex, administrative overhead, and sponsored registries, I don't agree with this personally, but for better or for worse, they still cast a bit of a shadow of bias in the clinical community. If it's a profound sponsored registry, is the data being presented kind of biased? So for you to invest millions of dollars into something just for somebody to interpret that data with some bias, you need to weigh the pros and cons about doing that, as opposed to doing, help motivate some investigator-initiated studies. We at Profound, we definitely recognize the value at registries. We've set up an international registry that we call CARE for our Tulsa Pro device, which is a prostate device, and we invite all of our sites on an international scale to participate in this registry. The CARE registry is run in-house. We do not go through a CRO, and we do invite all of our sites to participate. Other notable examples of registries, at least in the prostate space, you have a number of large national registries. One example is the CAPTURE database. It's run by UCSF. There's over 150,000 prostate cancer patients in that database, and there's certainly a role for that kind of registry where you're looking at the types of effects on such a massive scale. The COLD registry for cryotherapy is probably the largest prostate ablation registry that exists. And while I applaud the COLD registry for gathering all of that data and publishing on that data, going back to my comments on the reimbursement side, there's still a little bit of questioning as to whether they were successful in using the COLD registry data to really break into the full-scale market that we all are looking for. The HEAT registry by Sonoblade is another great example of registries. There was a registry called SPARED that was sort of co-sponsored by the FDA and academic institutions. That one never ended up lifting off the ground due to complexities with data sharing agreements, so that's another example of where some of these challenges become very real. And I know that the Focal Therapy Society has a registry that's vendor agnostic for prostate ablation. And so my last point before I turn to questions and turn to the panels is that while I believe that manufacturers do play a role and have some accountability in gathering that real world data and sharing it with the clinical community, I think it's an interesting question to also think about when and how is it the right time to sort of transition from a manufacturer sponsored registry towards more of a community-based registry? When do you transfer that ownership from the manufacturer to the physician community and get to something like the CAPTURE database? So with that in mind, I'd like to explore a few questions here with the panel. The first one is, how do you see the role of clinical registries in determining standards of care for emerging therapies? And the first question, I'll ask Katie to start us off.
Yeah, it's a good question. So at InsightTech, we have a couple commercial approvals for indications, particularly in movement disorders, essential tremor a few years ago, and recently, just about a year ago now, in Parkinson's. And so there are, required post-approval studies. So the decision is not really given to you. Those are required post-approval registries. And so we are gathering data as a part of that requirement. But then, once you get past those post-approval studies that just fulfill those requirements, creating a structure for generating real-world evidence to drive beyond approval into market access and to drive society recognition, clinical recommendations, that's really key. And a lot of times those post-approval studies, you're in an environment where you do not have reimbursement. So your numbers are small. Our internal clinical affairs team has moved on to, getting the next approval. And so the infrastructure, is not really there in place. Yet, we know that there are a lot of people out there who don't have access to focused ultrasound technology, and we know that there are a lot of people out there who could benefit from it. And so, I think everybody here at the Focused Ultrasound Foundation Symposium, would agree with that across many different indications. And so, to get people access to the technology, we've sort of shifted our thinking from being a time to market thought process to a time to value. And so, you have to convince all of the different stakeholders within the system about the value of focused ultrasound. And so it's not just, you get past the FDA, great, but then how do you provide value to physicians, the treating physicians? How do you provide value to the referrers? How do you provide value to the hospital administrators? You need to think about each and every one of those stakeholders within this ecosystem that you're operating in. And of course, the most important stakeholder within that is the patient, their family, their friends, their caregivers. We need to think systematically about each person within this system and provide them, with a clear value. And especially as an emerging disruptive technology, you're entering a space where there are established players, established relationships, and if you're coming in and you're only thinking about, okay, I need to talk to this neurosurgeon because they're the one who's going to be the user of my technology, it's really short-sighted. You need to think about all those different stakeholders and think about how you're providing value to each and every one of them. And only when you do that will it then become, in I think our way of thinking, the standard of care. Yeah. You need to satisfy all those value requirements across the board.
Yeah, and Katie, at InsightTech, I know you guys have a number of different indications, and you've run a number of sponsored clinical trials, some of them being randomized to get your approvals, to get, some national positive coverage decisions that you do on some of your indications. So give us a sense of where you see, from your perspective, how do you balance the value between something like a registry versus some of your sponsored trials, and where do you think you got most out of those to establish that as standard of care, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so, it's, I don't know where we are in the standard of care sort of, pipeline. I don't think we're there yet. I think we have a long way to go in convincing people. In essential tremor, it's a different marketplace where, a lot of patients are coming direct to the neurosurgeon. They aren't being treated for their essential tremor. There's a ton of people with essential tremor out there, and a handful of them, 5% or 10%, whatever it is now, that are seeking treatment. The rest of those folks are out there. They're not being treated by a neurologist, and so the sort of direct patient or direct consumer into the neurosurgery system, it makes sense. We know who to talk to and who to educate. But now as we're moving into Parkinson's, we're moving into neuro-oncology, it's a very different system. Now you've got these patients who are under the care of someone who is different from the person who's going to administer the treatment. And so, we need, I think, as we move from this sort of direct consumer to neurosurgeon, where we were able to just rely on the clinical trial data because it was held within the neurosurgery department, now we need to really start thinking more about collecting real-world data to convince these other folks who may not be involved in the treatment. So I think it will become more important to us as we move into these indications that include different and more extensive types of referral patterns.
Yeah, that's interesting. And maybe to ask you a similar question, Karen, you guys, you did your FDA studies, you have your registry, you do have a CPT code. It came live, I think, this year. The payment is increasing for next year. So there's a lot of positive momentum from that direction. Again, I don't know if we're quite at the discussion that we're standard of care from that perspective, but you're kind of moving along that pathway. Do you see registries having played an important role in that pathway? And if so, how? And if not, why not?
No, I definitely do. I think a couple things. You did mention that company-sponsored registries kind of can still be accused of being biased and that sort of thing. I think that is legitimate. But I think as we're talking about disruptive technologies and getting into this marketplace and trying to become standard of care, one of the most important things to be able to say is, as a manufacturer, as a company, I support us collecting data. I believe in my data, and I want to collect my data, and I want to publish outcomes based on that. And I think that's hugely important when you're trying to make this shift from disruptive to standard of care. So I do think they're very important. I agree with you that also you're always going to have naysayers out there. The easiest way to, not to sound too negative, to punch down, though, is to say it's company sponsored, it's biased, that sort of thing, sure.
Yeah, but data is king at the end of the day, and so if you have good data, you have good data, right? So,
right.
So I'll move on to the second question. What are the challenges that you overcame in both this setting up and executing clinical registries? And Karen, we'll start with you.
Yeah, wow. A lot, actually. So what's interesting is within the UK, they can perform HIFU for prostate tissue ablation as long as they will get reimbursed by the NHS, their public health system, as long as they are collecting data in a registry. So that's really how this started, was they had to be able to do this in order to get reimbursement. What's been amazing about it is that it has now probably around 4,000 patients in there, some follow-up as long as 15 years. So it's been very important for us. But as far as what's been some of the biggest challenges for that, because as we roll out into the U.S., we want to roll that same heat registry that's in the UK that's been so beneficial into the U.S., things like data sharing agreements across the pond. You would think from one institution to another institution, it's not that big of a deal. It's a huge deal. Getting IRB approvals just for this. Patient consents. Do you need a patient consent? Do you not need a patient consent, right? Because there's two schools of thought that it's just a quality data registry. You shouldn't have to get patient consent. We're just looking at outcomes. But there's a completely other school of thought that absolutely every patient has to be consented to have their information put into this registry. Trying to reach a consensus among users as far as what is important data to collect. That has been amazing. So we started a U.S. branch of a steering committee that it was about 6 to 8 physicians. And we would get in a room and we'd say, okay, what are the bare minimum? And you would have one physician say, I need these 15 things. And then you have another physician that says, no, I need these 30 things. And then you have another physician that says, no, y'all are both wrong, and I want these other opposite 15 things. And for a while, it felt like we were just saying the same thing over and over and over every meeting that we had. And I think where we settled was just collect it all. And if you want to put the 15 things, or if you want to put the 5 things, we're going to just put it in there, and then we're going to see what we have that we can publish off of. So I think, we've talked about a lot of the problems, or I've talked about a lot of the problems with the data registry. I think if there's one thing I would say is to begin with, to keep it small, you know, as a solution. Keep it small, roll it out with a small, intimate group, get buy-in there, and then go elicit buy-in from a larger group, and just slowly roll that out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I can speak from our perspective, the data sharing agreement piece. The data sharing agreement from the site to us as the sponsor was a lot more straightforward than dealing with a data sharing agreement from two different sites, you know, cooperating on something. So I can certainly appreciate that. Matthias, I know that you at Mint and Brain Lab, you have a number of registries, and so before talking about sort of the successes, what are some of the challenges that you face when you look to setting up these registries?
Oh, yeah, there's quite a number of challenges to cope with. So what we already heard, and I think this is really one of the key points, is that we have to have a design of the platform and the registry itself that really incentivizes all the participants. So people will not contribute, data will not have a certain data quality, the actual processes, the collaboration, everything have to be set up in a way that that we gather high quality data. So there need to be corrective actions or random sample data, you know, data reviews, things like that need to be implemented, and people have to be incentivized so that in the very end, well, the work of gathering high quality structured data then will lead to also what we want to achieve. And then, well, we were talking about data governance and data sharing, and those are just the organizational efforts and challenges, but then there is also obviously challenges related to the software tools and the vendors that support us also in setting up a registry. So I think registries require you know, very close support of the users by dedicated teams. Oftentimes the CROs claim that they could cover the whole thing, but I think they are really strong from an operational point of view when it comes to custom tailored software tools or more sophisticated tools that actually could deal with specialized types of data or a broad range of types of data across different disciplines. Then having still a cohesive platform is still a challenge as well.
Yeah, when you talk about software tools and so on, do you use the same tools for all of your registries or studies, or do you kind of customize it depending on the needs of the particular registry?
At Brain Lab, we have the philosophy that all our products shall be, I would say, data aware and enabled to deliver smart data and structured data. So depending on a registry, we may involve our own custom-built patient-reported outcome solution to implement the patient engagement, which we consider to be a very important piece of registries, so that we truly can actually work out the value for the actual patients that we want to improve the treatments for. But then there are other modules related to specialties like radiotherapy or different other very specific treatment options. We have sophisticated imaging and image analysis and ways how we do structured reporting along with these images to have consistent measurements on all the data. In the very end, you try to harmonize a research environment across different centers and different disciplines, and this is why it's so important to have a tool set that is really working well with each other.
Yeah. You also touch on an interesting point on sort of patient outcomes, and I know, you know, speaking for Profound in our registries, we see it as a great opportunity to engage with the patient and bring the patient voice into the data capture as well. I mean, we do that with patient-reported quality of life, but the way that we've set up our registries, it's an effective and easy way for the site to automatically communicate with the patient and get some of that quality of life information, get some diary information, you know, time back to work and things like that. And so I think once you work through some of these hurdles on a registry, you know, to set up a registry, you can come out the other way in a situation where engaging with that patient and getting that patient voice into your data set will prove to be very valuable and almost worth as much as sort of the more traditional clinical data outcomes as well. For the third and final question, what lessons can we learn from successful registries, whether in focused ultrasound or other therapies? And Matthias, I'd like you to start off with that.
Thank you. So Matthew, I think first of all, I think we need to understand what a registry is the right tool for. And I think registries and clinical trials really partially complement each other. I would say while a clinical trial can be like your razor sharp LED lights that you have in the front of your car, a registry may be more like the fog lights that give so much more sight to the left and the right that allow you just to have a more comprehensive overview. So in general, registries, they may allow you to come up with new hypotheses, to explore, the data, to come up with new ideas, understand certain correlations. Whereas in trials, you will always just get the very specific answers to those particular primary endpoints that you have asked a question for, and you may really oversee certain things. And we can learn from registries. So one example is AO Foundation's Global Data Registry. They just started a couple of years ago. This is a huge orthopedic and trauma registry. At the moment, after 3 years, they already have 5 million patients covered, 17 million patient-reported outcome forms completed. And what they actually do is, by that, they also standardize how they work. So the treatment, the actual treatment options and the approaches are also more standardized working within this registry. And as you work in a more standardized and more systematic environment, it also is easier for you as a community to really let the actual community and the knowledge in your specialty thrive and make systematic improvements of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's also very interesting on looking at how your treatments or on how your devices are impacting and what kind of new things that your users are doing. Karen, when you're running the heat registry or some other, when you're looking at your data, have you ever learned any sort of important lessons from that perspective that kind of opened up the doors to maybe? We talked about BPH, for example, on the previous panel. That's not necessarily an indication that you were looking at particularly, but is there some positive lessons learned that you've seen through your registries?
Well, I think one of the most interesting ones, right, is that when we first started, again, in the UK, you were seeing whole gland treatments done. And then slowly there's this shift to focal. And again, that heat registry data has been hugely impactful to show focal is legitimate and can be offered. It's safe, it's efficacious, all of those things. And it's not to say that whole gland is not, it's to say that we have a new and probably better way to treat, and now we actually have the data and long-term data to actually show that. So I think that's one huge thing. I don't think that if we had that registry, if we just started that registry in the last 5 years, we wouldn't have seen all of that. I think it was absolutely part of where we started with whole gland to how we've transitioned.
Absolutely, and then you can do some comparisons between your whole gland data versus your focal data. And again, the key word, if you had started 5 years ago, you'd only have 5 years outcomes. Well, you'd have 5-year outcomes as opposed to, I think it's 10 or 15 at this point that you have with the UK data. Yeah, we've certainly seen that in our registries where we had an intent to commercialize within a particular space in the prostate market, and it's actually learning from our physician users. How do they use it? Where do they see value? What kind of patients do they treat with our device? And are those interesting additional markets that we might want to explore further, either with sponsored studies or investigator-initiated studies or just larger registries. Katie, in your case, have you seen that kind of same effect where you've put in a registry or some sort of clinical trial for one thing and you end up learning from your users and opening up the doors almost to additional indications?
Well, I think it's really we work with some of the most amazing centers, in the world, and they've been with us and they executed the pivotal studies, and then they went on, and it's sort of been an organic situation where they are really interested in helping InsiTech and moving the field of focused ultrasound forward without it being this established registry. We have not provided that sort of structure outside of for all of our centers at this point. And it's really incredible to see how they are organically collaborating with each other and creating this community and learning about different targeting strategies, different numbers of sonications, looking at different skull density ratios, and evaluating different implantables that are questionable, or can you do a high intensity procedure with a pacemaker or shunts, or so they're learning from each other and they're publishing on it, and we're really excited to be a part of pulling all of those different groups together in a more systematic way to answer questions that are popping up, but that each site separately may not have the numbers to be able to manage independently.
Fantastic. In the last few minutes, do we have any questions from the audience? I'm looking at the iPad here, and I don't think I see any questions. Are there any questions from the audience that you'd like to ask the panel? Okay. Well, I think we summarized a lot of different concepts that, registries, while they can be very challenging, they can be expensive, they can be complex, they can, there's ethics involved, so on and so forth, that they do bring a lot of value to the field. They may not be the one-stop shop holy grail to fully establish yourself as standard of care. You likely have to supplement that with other trials, namely a randomized control trial. But at the end of the day, doing the heavy lifting up front, as Karen was describing with her registries in the UK, pays off in dividends in that 5, 10, 15 years later. And if you don't do that work up front, it's just a lost opportunity from a timing perspective. So this was a very informative conversation for myself. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I thank the panel members and Matthias for joining us virtually.
Thank you.